I feel for the family it's an appalling crime. I've spoken to the new Justice Secretary. We will review the policy together.
This is a former colleague of yours.
People still feel this as an incredibly raw event. I think everybody across the political spectrum, I hope, wants to see his killers serve their sentence.
We have struggled to cope and provide the capacity necessary.
Very few people who are in for life sentences. Very few.
When you're
less than 10% of the prison population.
Look
at the numbers.
I'm wondering if Andy Burnham woke up this morning feeling a bit Phil Connors. You know, the weatherman in Groundhog Day, destined to relive the same day over and over. Because the new PM, on only day 3 in the office, could be forgiven for thinking he'd been transported back to summer 2024, doomed to deal with all the problems that scuppered Keir Starmer's political honeymoon. Take the prison crisis for starters.
I didn't want to release prisoners early. I was chief prosecutor for 5 years. It goes against the grain of everything I've ever done. But to be blunt, if we hadn't taken that difficult decision immediately, we wouldn't have been able to respond to the riots as we did.
That was the newly minted PM in August 2024, and now Andy Burnham has been hoisted by the very same petard, forced to announce a review of the early prisoner release scheme after the widow of PC Andrew Harper said it was deplorable 2 of his killers could be freed early.
I feel for the family it's an appalling crime that was committed. The main perpetrator will not be subject to any early release. Of course, others involved have potentially been identified, but I've spoken to the new Justice Secretary. We will review the policy together and make further statements in due course.
And on the economy too, Burnham seems to be obliged to reconsider Starmer's funding headache.
I have to be honest with you. Things are worse than we ever imagined. In the first few weeks, we discovered a £22 billion black hole in the public finances.
Funnily enough, Burnham declared a commitment to honesty too, but he put a rather sunnier spin on it.
I will always be honest with the public. It's my style. This week, the 3 policies I've announced, ending rough sleeping, the bus cap we're announcing today, and the removal of VAT off electricity bills are all fully funded. And that's the way I will go.
Well, I'm going to be honest with you too. It's not quite as rosy as it all sounds. Ministers up and down Whitehall are currently looking behind the sofa for the dosh to fund that VAT cut, and capping bus fares will come out of the international aid budget. Not to mention how on earth he pays for far bigger spending commitments like social care reform and the biggest council house building programme since the post-war period. We'll really know we've gone full Groundhog Day, though, when we hear Burnham say things are worse than he ever imagined, with a multi-billion-pound black hole in the defence budget. Perhaps once he's popped next door to number 11 and seen his Chancellor, who quit Starmer's government over the lacuna at the MOD. Welcome to Wednesday's show then, and we're going to be talking also about Andy Burnham's bus fares cap for most of England a bit later on, and ask where the money's going to come from for all these announcements he's been making. But before we do that, let's get the details of this row that's erupted after it emerged that the killers of PC Andrew Harper could be freed after serving just half their sentences. It's because of a prison overcrowding scheme, which the new Prime Minister has now promised is going to be reviewed. Here's our chief political correspondent, John Craig.
I'm arresting both of you on suspicion of murder.
It was a crime that shocked the nation. This was the arrest of killers of 28-year-old PC Andrew Harper, who was dragged by a getaway car for more than a mile along country roads in Berkshire after he'd gone to investigate the theft of a quad bike. His ankles were caught in a tow rope loop. He was 28, married for just a month. Now his distraught mother has received a letter from the Ministry of Justice telling her 2 of his killers, jailed in 2020 for 13 years for manslaughter, could be released early to ease prison overcrowding. She says it's an insult. The pair, Jessie Cole and Albert Bowers, who were 17 at the time of the crime, were accomplices in the car, driven by Henry Long, who was jailed for 16 years and is not eligible for early release.
I've got to sit, I think, very, very hot.
Under Labour's 2026 Sentencing Act, set to come into force in September, up to 6,000 offenders could be released early in England and Wales. But as senior Tories claimed releasing PC Harper's killers would be a travesty of justice, the Prime Minister promised a review of the policy.
I feel for the family it's an appalling crime that was committed. The main perpetrator will not be subject to any early release. Of course, others involved have potentially been identified, but I've spoken to the new Justice Secretary. We will review the policy together and make further statements in due course.
The new PM also said ministers apparently joking about early release when they gathered for his first cabinet meeting was not acceptable. In an emotional statement, PC Harper's widow Lissy said it had taken years to rebuild a life torn apart. It's deplorable to me that we've reached a point where releasing prisoners early is even considered acceptable, she said. Andrew deserves better. Every victim deserves better. And the British public deserve a justice system they can have faith in. She also said that when she fought for Harper's Law, a mandatory life sentence for killing emergency workers while committing a crime, she was supported not only by the then Conservative government, but by Labour too. A former Tory minister commissioned by Labour to make recommendations on early release said prison overcrowding couldn't be ignored.
When you start to look at the prison overcrowding crisis that the country faced a year or so ago, it was necessary to take action and come forward with proposals that addressed it and also prevents future crises from happening again.
But PC Harper's widow says for victims' families this is not about politics, but whether justice is something people can truly believe in.
Well, John, do Andy Burnham and his team have the scope to cancel this early release scheme, or are they a bit stuck given prison numbers?
Well, the Justice Secretary, Alex Norris, the PM said he'd spoken to him about this, now faces a race against time for that very reason, because it's due to come into effect, this policy, at the beginning of September. That's in 6 weeks' time, when the House of Commons and the House of Lords are back after the summer recess. So the clock is ticking, Nick Timothy, the Shadow Justice Secretary, said today. It was Priti Patel who said it was a travesty of justice. She was the Home Secretary at the time when this dreadful crime was committed. Now, the problem that Mr Norris has got is that the prisons are currently at 97% capacity. That's not quite as high, not quite the highest they've ever been, but it's very close to it. And, of course, Mr Norris, who's taken over from David Lammy, is already facing a row over the curbs on jury trials. And so he really has got his work cut out. Notice the Prime Minister said he talked about a review of the policy, not just this case. Now, there are opposition politicians saying this should go much wider than this particular case. Rapists, other killers, grooming gang leaders, all those sort of people. So this has really opened up that row over the early release scheme. And Mr Norris is going to have to work pretty quickly, because it comes in, it's September the 2nd, which is actually the day that the Commons and the Lords are back. So a race against time for Mr Norris. More embarrassment for the Prime Minister, a tricky problem for him in his first week. Could there be another U-turn? It looks as though there could well be a U-turn on this, because the public will be appalled at these individuals being released. At the time of their trial, it was said in court they showed no remorse. They were smirking, laughing and so on, and causing great distress to PC Harper's widow and indeed her mother, who got that letter from the Ministry of Justice today and has talked about it and said it's an insult. So a big problem for a big law and order problem for the new Prime Minister here, just as he's trying to shape the agenda on all his nice consumer-friendly cost of living measures. Suddenly he's got a law and order crisis on his hands and real pressure to make a U-turn on this particular sentencing early release policy.
Yeah, John, thanks very much. And we'll have more on those cost of living policies soon. But this is what happens with a Prime Minister in office. Let's hear now from our sofa duo, Labour peer Baroness Thangam Debbonaire, former Education Secretary Gillian Keegan. They're here with me tonight. And Thangam, this is what happens as Prime Minister, isn't it? That you're trotting along, setting the agenda, and then something happens and you have to react to it.
Yes, and absolutely right that he has reacted to it, because even just seeing the banner on the screen there of a reminder of what actually happened to PC Harper, which was absolutely horrific. But we also have a situation when the Labour government took over, there were just 100 prison places available, which is full to capacity. There was already an unofficial semi-early release scheme in operation, and that's because of prison capacity. I had a prison when I was a Member of Parliament in my constituency. I watched prison policy in action when the previous government had 14 years and built about 500 places. We've built 3,000 in the last 2 years, and it's not enough, and we're going to have to do more. And I'm very, very glad that Andy has responded, as he has, to even the very thought that this man's murderers could be.
You knew that was coming, but it's true, isn't it?
Well, Thangam will be thanking us, because the 3,000 that there are all due to the prison rebuilding programme that we put in place, which is 5 new prisons. So
yeah, you left it too late, that's the point.
Well, actually, what really happened, which meant that the time pressure really was consolidated, was when we had COVID, basically there was no court cases. So the remand part of the prison has gone up by more than double. So that took about 10,000 places out of the system, because there's more people on remand waiting for their court date, and that backlog is still there, which is why there's been a lot of focus. So without COVID, then there would have been an extra 10,000 places. The building would have happened. Also, the building was delayed a bit because of COVID, and that was the plan. But the plan has, was under pressure because we've got more remand prisoners, etc. But for this particular case, there is absolutely no way. The initial review of letting prisoners out early was for those with sentences less than 4 years.
That's quite right.
These two have sentences of 13 years. And I think they should add something else, because someone said, oh, well, we've added if it's good behaviour. Well, they didn't show good behaviour before they went into prison, right? And they didn't show any remorse. And I think that should be a deal breaker for victims' families. If there's no remorse, you cannot be seen to show good behaviour. In prison, absolutely not.
Thangam, should the whole early release scheme be cancelled or paused? Or is it possible to redraw it to take out the most serious offenders, rapists, paedophiles, and, people committing serious offences?
Several things can be true at the same time. I mean, review, I think these are what Andy said, and I think that's obviously going to happen urgently. Alex Norris, who is our new Justice Secretary, is an excellent, highly competent, very hard-working minister, as he has been as Secretary of State.
David Lammy.
And the reasons that Gillian's given about, COVID, well, there were 10 years, and I was, at that time, for 5 years an MP of a prison, and I could see what inaction was doing.
Yeah, I'm trying to look forward,
where we are now, yes, yes.
I can see,
I think it's important.
we've discussed the legacy of the last.
Well, people always choose where to invest, right?
So it's part of, in context.
But it's part of the investment. Prison places are never the number one thing to invest in, but we had to do it. And then COVID meant that it was the demand came forward earlier. So that's what happened. And you just have to deal with what you have to deal with. So the modular cells, which are the 3,000 places, were the ones that we started to put in place, which is the quick deployment. You have to deal with it.
So what happens now?
You have to deal
what
with.
Do you do now?
Well, we have to be able to make the choice that Gillian said is really hard to make, which is to choose to build prison places. And we're going to have to build more.
The 4 years, though, is not a lot of people.
There were consequences.
This is not a numbers game.
There were consequences. But the thing is, it is. Because you're criticising the Labour government, and you're
but there's very few people who are in for life sentences. Very few.
When you're
less than 10% of the prison population. Look at the numbers. It's numbers.
When you're criticising the government for early release, you have to take into account the fact that the numbers of prison places were not good enough, and they were not, but nobody paid attention to them until we're in this problem. So,
but yes, I want to pull you back,
but
I don't accept that, because there's only about 7,000 people of the 87,000 places that have these longer sentences. So I don't accept that.
Yeah, but
these
these
are
are
the
3,000
people that need to be
extra
Okay,
capacity,
right,
by
the
the way.
prison that
Most of them are lower sentences. They're the ones that should be
prison that was
out
in
early.
Bristol, that I was in the patch that I represented, we had people with extraordinary long sentences in what was supposed to be a transit prison, what was supposed to be a reception prison. We had rapists who were stuck there for years, and that was under the Tories because there was nowhere to send them. They were in unsuitable places. It made for a dangerous regime, which, despite the best efforts of those prison governors, the prison governor and the prison officers, was never safe. Now, that was prior to COVID. So where we are now...
Yeah, because that's what I want. And can
now,
I just ask a question? Seeing as, you know, the conversation's moved on to this point, what do we do? Do we exempt the most serious? You know, do we cancel the whole scheme? Or, you know, is there a problem because there's only 3,000 spare places? If you cancel it or redraw it, you're going to end up with the same crisis that you did 2 years ago, which prompted Keir Starmer to introduce this legislation.
Which nobody wants to be in the same crisis place as we've been in for far too long. And that is why I think Andy's absolutely right to say we have to review it and set Alex Norris to work to make sure that he's listening to voices like you've had David Gork on Sky News earlier. David Gork, who's done a lot of work on reviewing prisons policy. James Timpson, who's our outgoing prisons minister, who has a substantial amount of experience and has a great deal to contribute. Alex Norris will be wanting to get on with this at speed, and I'm sure he is.
These buildings, these prisons, which started under our watch, they've got to be close to completion now. There was 5 new prisons that were being built. They were delivering 20,000 new places. 3,000 have already been delivered. There must be more coming very soon.
And that's after
and for
10 years
this,
in action.
for this 4 years, at some point you're going to have to accept responsibility. You're in government. You're now on your second government. At some point you're going to have to accept responsibility.
You might have to, before you criticise us for the impact of policies that went on years before COVID, you might have to accept responsibility for that, rather than blaming
10,000 remand places due to COVID is what meant that it was very, very
The problem
close.
was occurring in 2015.
You don't build capacity with 15,000 spare places. You just don't. There isn't enough money for that.
Nothing happened.
I'm
have
going
to
to
do
break
it as
up
you
this track.
can.
You know, you're usually so collegiate.
I know, but
this is really
numbers matter. Numbers matter.
You're absolutely right. Numbers do matter.
But this case, he is one. He is one, and these 2 people should stay in prison. So those 2
Absolutely,
places
which Andy has
they
said.
should keep.
On that note of agreement, we're going to move on, but we're going to come back to this whole discussion in a moment, because a little earlier I spoke to Matthew Barber, Police and Crime Commissioner for Thames Valley, PC Harper's force. Matthew Barber, Andy Burnham has committed to reviewing this early prisoner release scheme. Is that the right decision?
Well, I certainly hope it is, but once again, with Andy Burnham, we don't know any of the details. I think the news that Andy Harper's killers might be released early has shocked people in Thames Valley. Obviously, it has a huge impact on the family. But this really just highlights the wider problems with the Sentencing Act. I think it's right that these killers should stay in prison and serve their sentence. I think that's what most people would expect, but it's not good enough just to review things around this case. We need to have a proper look again at the Sentencing Act and some of the perhaps unintended consequences that it creates.
Because some Conservatives are saying just cancel the early release entirely. But would you say don't go that far, just exclude, you know, sex offenders and serious criminals from this early release?
Well, undoubtedly, we do have a challenge around prison places, but the solution cannot surely be to say we're going to let thousands of criminals back out onto our streets, which is going to put more pressure on our police officers, who are just going to be going around rounding these people up again for more offences that they commit. We'd like to see more victims of crime. And at the other end of the spectrum, we're seeing it harder to get sent to prison in the first place. Fewer and fewer people going into prison for custodial sentences. So I do think we have a real problem with the Sentencing Act. I think it probably is right to look at the whole thing again, because we're seeing some really perverse outcomes.
But then you're going to be back where we were 2 years ago, where, you know, there was a crisis that prisons were going to overflow if they didn't take urgent action. And now you've got, what, headroom of 3,000 vacant spaces, I think, in prisons across England and Wales. So if you repeal that act, you're going to be back to square one, aren't you?
Well, part of the problem with the Sentencing Act in particular is it just makes some blanket changes to people's sentences. It doesn't allow the Lord Chancellor, for example, to intervene in particular cases. It just looks at particular crime types and says, that's it, you're getting out early. So it doesn't take into account any risk around individual prisoners, the risk they might pose to other people in the community. So I think we do need a fundamental look again, that it's not just about, most people don't want to see prisoners released early, full stop, but we need to look at the mechanisms in which this government has put in place to do that, because I think they are going to cause real problems for people across the country.
So you could have a much more tailored scheme, you think?
Absolutely. If you look at some of the previous early release schemes, they were much more nuanced. And whereas the Sentencing Act has taken a really blanket approach, and it sees people not just released early from prison, but making it harder for people to go to prison in the first place. And one of the great ironies, sadly, about this awful case with Andy Harper is that following his death, Parliament passed new legislation known as Harper's Law, which meant that if those individuals had committed the same offence now, they would be serving a whole life sentence. And yet we're in a situation where actually they're likely to come out of prison early.
So when you heard that 2 of his killers were or might be eligible for early release, what did you think?
Well, it was shock when I heard the news last night, quite frankly, and I can only imagine what the family were going through. We know, I've been well aware of the challenges that the Sentencing Act would bring, but the government certainly said during the passing of that legislation that they were seeking to prevent these most egregious cases from happening. And actually what we see is time and time again, we see these problematic cases coming through, and that's why I think it's quite right that we have a fundamental look again at what is a very fresh piece of legislation, but we can already see the ill effects.
This is a former colleague of yours.
So he was a much-loved member of Thames Valley Police, and I've met many times with his widow. Organisationally, across the whole policing family, people still feel this as an incredibly raw event. We had a memorial service recently to unveil a memorial in Reading to Andrew Harper, but it's not just within policing. I think across our communities in Thames Valley, people really felt this incident. They felt the impact of a brave police officer going out to do his duty, dealing with a reported burglary, and then paying the ultimate price for it. That's why I think it's right that the law was changed, and the public would expect the government to take action and change the legislation.
It is an appalling story, absolutely shocking. I wonder whether some people watching will worry that the Conservatives, you're a Conservative yourself, are politicising this terrible personal tragedy for their own ends. What do you say to that, given when you look at the crisis that the incoming government in 2024 had to deal with? Some of that, a great part of that was because the Tories had been in power for 14 years and they hadn't built enough jail places. Do you accept that?
I've always been really clear. I think governments of all parties have failed to invest enough in our prison system. Frankly, it's not something that the public are ever interested in until there is a crisis. Putting millions of pounds into prison building is never an election-winning strategy. And undoubtedly, previous governments have failed, and this government need to redouble their efforts if they want to get us out of this. But the solution cannot be to let dangerous people back out onto our streets, which is going to put the public at risk now. And I've worked with Lizzie and her family as part of that process to get Harper's Law in place. I don't see anybody politicising this. I see a tragedy, and I think everybody across the political spectrum, I hope, wants to see his killers serve their sentence.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, as you say, the public's not interested in this until there's a crisis. But if you look at the figures, I went back and looked at the figures today. The UK has one of the highest incarceration rates in Western Europe. So the prison population doubled in size between 1992 and 2012. Are we still sending too many lower-level offenders to prison, do you think?
Well, we certainly won't be with the Sentencing Act. It's going to be quite hard to get yourself sent to prison. I think there are some fundamental changes I think we do need in our prisons. We have a massive problem of drugs within our prisons. People going into prison, coming out addicted to more drugs than they went in with. That's a really serious issue that we need to get to grips with, to make prison actually work. Absolutely, it should be a punishment, but we should also be seeking to rehabilitate people while they're inside. So I think we should do more around that. I also think we need a more honest conversation with the public about sentencing, because the idea of early release is not a new one. We've seen for years people talk about having an amount off your sentence. I think for most people, they would expect someone to serve the sentence that a court decides. So actually, even if those numbers were slightly lower, actually knowing that someone is going to go to prison for that period and perhaps have a period of licence beyond that would be a much more honest approach. And what we've seen, sadly, is that we can talk tough about a high tariff for an offence. But frankly, if everybody, from the public to the criminals themselves, know that they're never going to serve that offence, then it serves no purpose.
Do you think the public would be up for that honest conversation?
Well, I think honesty is surely the only way forward to tackle issues like this. I don't think we should shy away from locking people up. I think it's right to have punishment for people who break the rules. It is also right for public protection to keep people locked up. But while they're there, we should be seeking to rehabilitate people. We should be seeking to get people off drugs, teaching them to read and write if they're not able to, getting them in a state where they can maybe get a job and contribute to society after they leave. But you don't achieve that by letting thousands of people out of prison. And at the bottom end of the system, what this Sentencing Act does means that swathes of people will not go to prison for what some people might be considering low-level offences. But these are prolific offenders who perhaps hound our shopkeepers on our high streets, you know, tens, if not hundreds, of shoplifting offences and no meaningful punishment. That cannot be right.
You said it would be quite hard to get yourself sent to jail under the new Act. But why do you think it is that we do jail more people than in other parts of Western Europe? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think we need to look at the use of prison in its effectiveness. I think we have a problem about the lack of rehabilitation work, as I've talked about. The drugs problem in prison is a very serious one. So what you will see...
So it is the cycle of offending.
What you often see is people going into prison for a relatively short period of time, and they come out and they're committing the same offences again. Does that mean prison doesn't work as a concept, or does that mean actually the way we're running our prisons is ineffective? And I think actually at a time when the public would expect the state to have the most control over someone's life while they're in prison, actually we still see violence at levels that is really concerning. We see drugs at a level that is really concerning. We see drones being used to get drugs in and out of our prison. So there's a much wider issue about the effectiveness of our prison system, as well as the length of time we send people there for.
Just finally and briefly, the new Defence Secretary, Wes Streeting, has apologised for joking about the early releases. Do you accept that apology?
Well, I think it's certainly ironic, the timing of that. We see this sort of kerfuffle within the Labour Party over those comments. I think it's really unhelpful. I'm glad he has apologised. I'm glad the Home Secretary has apologised. But early release from prison is not a laughing matter. It's a very serious subject. And on the day that we hear this news that Andy Harper's killers might be released, it's hugely inappropriate.
Matthew Barber, thanks very much. Well, this story is sure to feature heavily on our late-night programme, The Wrap, tonight from 10 p.m. Here to discuss all of today's big stories and the best of tomorrow's papers too, of course, will be the FT's Whitehall editor, Lucy Fisher, and The Times' chief political correspondent, Aubrey Allegretti. Lots more still to come. We're going to be talking buses next.
I think it will really help people with the cost of living pressures they're facing. It's there for the whole of 2027, and I think it will put money in people's pockets.
Well, it's the second full day of Andy Burnham's premiership, and it started with another 6 a.m. press release trumpeting one of his priorities, capping most bus fares in England at £2 from January for a year. And as with ending homelessness and the removal of VAT on electricity bills, there were plenty of questions on the funding, as the bill from his first 72 hours in power reached over £1.5 billion. Let's get more from our chief North of England correspondent, Greg Milan.
Ask bus passengers in Manchester what they think about the £2 cap on fares that Andy Burnham introduced, and they're all on board.
I think it's a brilliant idea. Bus fare has been really expensive for years, and it's only just come down over the last couple of years. It's now cheaper for me to get around than it was 10 years ago.
Trying to get people out of cars and go on buses and that, so yeah, it's encouraging. So yeah, I'd rather it stay at £2.
I think this idea of the buses being at £2 is affordable, and it gives the pensioners a chance to go visit Manchester, Bury, Wigan, all on £2 expense.
It's why the new Prime Minister wants to spread that saving nationwide.
It was hugely popular because it's simple, but it saves people money every day. So I think it will really help people with the cost of living pressures they're facing. It's there for the whole of 2027, and I think it will put money in people's pockets.
But capping fares at £2 is all well and good if you can find a bus that you want to get on. This map from the Campaign for Better Transport shows the areas of England where that's a problem. The yellow areas need more bus stops, the amber has gaps in service, the red has severe gaps in service. One of those red areas is around Eccleshall in Staffordshire. The bus timetable tells the story of how few buses there are in such a rural area. So do the locals.
I once saw one.
What, a bus?
I once saw a bus.
You've seen one here?
Yeah, we do see them occasionally, very occasionally.
Yeah. A £2 fare would be good, but you've got to have the buses.
One on a Friday to
No, we don't
Newport.
have any
Do we have that
anymore.
Wednesday?
Don't we have? Oh gosh, I'm out of date. Don't have any then.
I think around here the biggest problem is there aren't enough of the buses in the first place. So.
Campaigners say 1 in 7 people in England live in places that don't meet the minimum baseline for service.
We know, in fact, that all that's required to get those areas out of the red, as it were, into a reasonable level of bus service is just £500 million a year, in fact. Even a bit less than that, and we'll get to that level. So it's not great figures. We can really get people to a great level of bus service provision. We think the next step after this bus fare cap is to really build on that and ensure that everybody has access to buses.
There are questions too about how this cap will be funded and how many operators will participate, because they can opt out. Changes in Manchester did result in a huge increase in public satisfaction with their bus services. Easing the cost of living nationwide is a whole different matter altogether. Greg Milam, Sky News.
Well, Thangam, Debbonaire and Gillian Keegan are on the sofa tonight. Thangam, this is another of Andy Burnham's pet projects. The tally is going up, £1.5 billion price tag, and he's not nearly done yet. Much bigger spending commitments to come: social care reform, council house building, homelessness we've had. But, you know, these are big projects, and there's sort of an open-ended kind of lack of concern about the bill.
I don't think there's a lack of concern. I think the primary driver here is the fact that he wants to tackle the cost of living, and he said that. He wants to be the cost of living government. Good, because that is what actually comes up on the doorsteps. But also, we're going to have a budget in the autumn, so each department is going to have to work on what they're going to put in for. And I think some of these announcements, if they give people the idea of the direction of travel Andy wants to go in, he does have to set out how he's going to pay for them. There is going to be a budget in the autumn. And I'm
cutting international aid to fund the £2 bus cap, that's OK with you?
Well, I would like to see... Well, I think he said
there's
something
hardly any left.
opposite.
International
aid's
been...
he said he was spending that. I don't know. I don't know.
It was what we were using for some of the defence.
I'm not writing the budget.
It's down to 0.3%. It's down to 0.3%.
I'm not writing the budget, but I do think we do have a process. We're going to have a budget. Departments will be putting in their bids at the moment.
Yeah, and you know how cash-strapped those departments are.
Yes, very.
Right, so the biggest problem is they're all cash-strapped. It's very simple to splurge the money on your pet projects. That is not the job. The most difficult job is creating the wealth, or removing all the barriers to creating the wealth, whether it's the energy costs, whether it's the national insurance, whether it's the cost of employing people, the difficulty of planning, or whatever it is. The one thing he's not mentioned, either all the way through his rather silent entrance into number 10, with not an interview in sight, is the economy.
The odd interview.
The odd interview about the Stone Roses. Let's be honest, it wasn't about the economy.
Was it about the Stone Roses?
It was about the Smiths and the... Well, he might have mentioned Oasis.
I think he did.
But it was about his pop. He's
going to sit on this sofa at some point.
Is he? And you're going to make him sing?
Well, I'll sing.
I'm going to make him talk about
sing it with him.
What hasn't he mentioned, Gillian?
But it's the economy, stupid. And literally, he must be stupid because he has not mentioned the economy once. You know what? It's obvious. Even Rachel and Keir got it on the way in. They didn't do much about it, but it was part of the mission's pledges. They said the most important thing is a growth mission. Yes. They didn't do it. They did the opposite. The budget actually threw us a wrench into the UK economy, and all the figures show that. But they at least recognised the problem, even if they didn't act upon it. He hasn't recognised it. So if he wants to spend money, he has to grow the economy. And he has to remove the barriers to doing so.
He does have to grow the economy, I absolutely agree. And I think, you know, one of the things that is going to happen over the next few months is we'll start to see more of the impact of decisions that Keir and Rachel did take. Gillian's absolutely right. They did talk about growth in the economy. They, a bit like you have mentioned COVID crisis today and its impact on the economy and on government spending, I'm going to chuck in the Ukraine war and the crisis in Iran. Every Prime Minister, as Andy is clearly discovering, has to deal with events, and they do affect your plans. So, yes, I want him to talk about the economy more as well. I agree with you.
That event was what we did. They were the domestic budgets, the two budgets that Rachel Reeves did.
I can point to the fact that we did have a good impact. We brought down NHS waiting lists, which also has a good impact on the economy. More people out of hospital. So let's not do this. So let's try not to.
Okay. But let's talk. You mentioned something interesting. You said events.
Yeah.
When you look at him being asked about the prison crisis in those clips, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because you got used to seeing, Keir Starmer sort of talking to camera, and it was all very polished, and people might not have liked him, but it was polished. Do you think it's dawning on him sort of how challenging this job is?
Well, it's quite a big switch, isn't it? And I think moving from Mayor of Manchester suddenly into a by-election, and then suddenly almost immediately straight into being Prime Minister. That's a big deal. But he's got around him some really good people who I think he is using, and I hope he's going to use them more and more. So, you know, we heard about from Heidi Alexander, who is an experienced Transport Secretary. She was on the airways today. She'll be doing the work behind these transport policies. Alex Norris, who has done really hard brief over the last few years in the Home Office, getting stuck into the Justice brief. And he's got a team. It's never about just one person.
His number one woman
and I want
is a convicted fraudster.
And I want him
His number
to
one
use
government person.
the skills
Yeah,
of
but,
the
you
people
know,
he's put around
she did
him.
her time on that. You know,
She didn't do her time on that.
Well,
she lied and said it was an accident. She didn't do her time on it.
If we notice the fact, you know, he's kept Bridget Phillipson and he's put her into Women Equalities, a role which we in Labour Women's Network have called for a long time to be absolutely standalone and dedicated to equalities. And I think that we've got some really good experienced people who Andy is using, and I hope that he does, because it's a team effort.
Right.
Being a government, as Gillian knows,
not one
is
of
a
them's
team
ever
effort.
worked in a business.
It was,
not
by the way,
a single one. None of them.
Lou Hay
which
was
is
a
why they
conditional discharge by magistrates, so I think you were slightly
Yeah, but when
unfair
you're a
over there.
conditional discharge, it means you are convicted. But if you do something wrong within that period, that's what the conditional means. It doesn't wipe away the sin.
She informed. It's a spent conviction. That was my point when I said she did her time. Anyway,
yes,
we're going to move on just now. Because with the Treasury's bills racking up, a little earlier I spoke to the director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Helen Miller. Helen Miller, when you look at, you know, VAT cut, the bus fare cap, the wider aspirations on council house building, social care, I'm just picking a few, is any of this affordable?
Well, if you look at the measures that have been announced so far, then actually, in the grand scheme of things, they're relatively small, and I'm sure the government will be able to move some money around this year to fund those small temporary measures. Panning out about the bigger pledges, if you think about mass council house building, more money for social care, more money for defence, those things are much, much more ambitious and will be much, much harder to find the money for. We already have a situation where the public finances are very tight. If the government does want to spend substantially more, it is going to have to either find really big cuts in other parts of governments or raise taxes substantially.
And I'll come back to, you know, the funding of this in a second, but I just wanted to, I've been looking back at the OBR figures, which are pretty startling, actually. If you look at UK debt, it's heading from 95% of GDP today to 300% by the 2070s. We're just, as a country, living beyond our means, aren't we?
Yeah, I think those OBR numbers are a good reminder that if we carry on as we are, if we carry on growing the state, if we want to have more healthcare, more social care, more defence, and we don't have the increase in tax to match that, then we are going to be in an unsustainable position. We're going to have borrowing going through the roof, and at some point the markets will stop borrowing to us. Now, those OBR numbers aren't really a projection. They're more of a warning of what happens if you don't do something. Obviously, therefore, we need to do something, and that something is either cut back some spending or cut back some ambitions over spending, or get serious about raising taxes.
Right, well, let's look at that then, because spending, we had this idea that the VAT cut on electricity bills yesterday would be funded by scrapping the ID scheme, and then, you know, various issues were raised on that, not least from an outgoing minister. How challenging is it to find the departmental spending cuts that will be needed for these priorities that Andy Burnham set out?
I mean, the short answer, I think, is very hard. If it was just a temporary VAT cut, you were just trying to find about £1 billion in 1 year, that would be relatively straightforward. But if that's a cut that becomes permanent, that's more like £2 billion you've got to find every year, and it comes on top of a long list of other things the government's probably going to want to find money for. For example, it might want to find another £10 billion for defence. It might want to find more money for social care. If you want to start finding tens of billions of pounds, then you can't just marginally reduce some spending programmes. You've got to really seriously start cutting back some things the state does. That is going to be a really difficult choice.
And I wonder whether you could arbitrate between the parties on this, because the Conservatives say, well, it's quite simple. You've got to cut back welfare spending. You know, there's a huge amount of money going into welfare spending, and that could be, I'm not saying easily cut back, but it's a target. If you speak to Labour backbenchers in particular, they talk about wealth taxes, they talk about raising taxation. You know, the burden of taxation is pretty high. But where do you sit between those two proposals? How doable are either of those?
Well, I think in some sense there is no single right answer. People will just fundamentally disagree about how they want to go forward here. You absolutely could cut welfare. You could cut welfare for disabled people, for other working age people, for pensioners. You could cut it quite substantially and you could use that money to spend on something else. You could also raise taxes. On taxes, what I would say is on the wealth tax in particular, if what people have in mind is a new annual tax on the stock of wealth, that would be a big administrative task to implement that. And if you want to raise a big amount from a small group of people, then the danger is that actually those people start, for example, moving out of the country. So we could raise more money, but it certainly isn't straightforward.
Is there low-hanging fruit on either of those options, though? For example, welfare, people talk about too many people being diagnosed with ADHD, for example, and then being given benefits accordingly. Is that low-hanging fruit? And on the other side of the coin, are there wealth taxes or raising taxation, harmonising CGT and income tax, for example, capital gains tax and income tax rates? Is that low-hanging fruit?
I think what makes these things difficult, actually, is there's not very much low-hanging fruit. Of course, you can tweak welfare, but if you want to make substantial savings, then you have to reform it more substantively. You have to decide, basically, which groups of people are no longer going to get support. Similarly, on taxes, there are some small things you can do quickly, but if you want to raise substantially more, then you actually have to redesign how some of those taxes work. So just to take capital gains tax as an example, if you just put up the rates, you wouldn't raise very much at all, actually. You might even start losing money. To raise substantial sums, you have to redesign what the tax is actually levied on, what is the tax base you're applying it to. You can do that for sure, but it's not very straightforward. So you'd have to do a serious reform before you raise big money.
Is there a sense that things have got out of kilter, that, what we want to do and what we want to fund as a state has sort of ballooned, and as a result, taxes are at their highest since, just after World War II? Is that, can you adjudicate on that?
It is definitely the case that public spending overall has been increasing now for the last few years, and pressures on the state have been increasing. We've been saying for a long time that ageing is happening. We have more older people. There are people who tend to demand more and more expensive health and social care. We have a welfare bill that is rising. People want more spending on education, for example, for children with special educational needs. All those demands on the state are rising, and if you want to fund them, then it's no surprise that we have higher taxes. Of course, that can't go on forever. At some point, you have to decide, do you want the state to do more defence or more something else? We can't keep having more of everything.
Of course, economic growth would fix this, and so perhaps some say would innovation in the shape of AI, for example. Are either of those things in prospect on the horizon?
So growth is absolutely kind of the thing that would make all of this easier. If incomes of people were growing, that would be the solution to the cost of living crisis, rather than short-term measures that make a few things a little bit cheaper. You need people to be more productive, to have higher wages to take home, to have higher living standards. And if the country were richer, then our debt would be more manageable. We could more afford to spend more on whatever it is the government wanted to spend more on. Now, getting up growth isn't easy, but the government can do things. It can chip away at lots of different policies: education policy, competition policy, tax policy, just to name a few. And if it consistently improved our policies, then we could expect growth to go up. But we should be expecting this to be a multi-year project, but one that is absolutely worth doing, because growth really is the only kind of proper solution out of all of this.
Coming back to Andy Burnham's immediate priorities, borrowing costs rose after he said he wanted some flexibility on the fiscal rules. How much room for manoeuvre does he have there?
I think the short answer is not very much room for manoeuvre. I mean, Rachel Reeves had a set of fiscal rules. There wasn't a huge amount of so-called headroom against those, meaning there's not much more you can borrow before you start breaching those fiscal rules. The war in the Middle East, the higher inflation has already reduced that headroom. So the government could do a bit more borrowing while it was still within those fiscal rules, but not very much. So the answer is not very much flexibility. If they want to spend more, they're going to have to look at either cutting other spending programmes or raising taxes.
And the costs of UK borrowing are already higher than comparable countries in Europe, aren't they? Just explain why that is.
Yeah, the costs of borrowing are pretty high in the UK. To give you a sense, 1 out of every £12 the government spends currently goes on debt interest. That's money that's not going on teachers or nurses or whatever else we might like. So that is a really substantive bill. There are actually a whole range of reasons why the rates are higher in the UK than elsewhere. One is the inflation, so the rate of increase in prices has been a bit higher in this country and it's been harder to get it down. There's also potentially an issue about fiscal credibility. Many governments, not just the last one, have kept saying they're going to reduce borrowing. When the time comes to actually do it, they push forward that pledge. They don't actually get round to it. So investors in the market investors, people who lend the government money, know that, and they probably put in some kind of premium when they're lending to the UK. So what we really need is the government to have some rules and stick to them, stick to those pledges to bring borrowing down, to take some of the pressure off the cost of borrowing.
Helen Miller there from the Institute of Fiscal Studies. Right, next up, we're talking about an MP's campaign for a summer of sex.
If we feel embarrassed just to talk about what is deemed as consensual, pleasurable sex, how on earth can we ever talk about horrible, awful, non-consensual rape? How can we do that?
Now, back in April, backbench Labour MP Samantha Niblett caused a bit of a stir when she said she wanted to launch a campaign for more inclusive, lifelong sex education and that she wanted to make 2026 the, quote, summer of sex. Well, with summer here today, she's kick-starting her campaign and she's been speaking to our political correspondent, Lucy McDade.
An MP talking about sex.
Are we too squeamish when we talk about getting it on? The Labour MP Samantha Niblett wants us to have a summer of sex, to openly talk about being intimate. It's a bit of fun, but also it's serious. Samantha wants sex education to be lifelong.
If we feel embarrassed just to talk about what is deemed as consensual, pleasurable sex, how on earth can we ever talk about horrible, awful, non-consensual rape? How can we do that?
And behind this campaign are some big issues. Studies suggest more than 1 in 4 women will be victims of sexual assault or attempted assault in their lifetimes. And it's estimated 85% of serious sexual offences aren't even reported to the police. Well, Samantha argues that sex education simply isn't good enough and wants it to be more comprehensive, not just in schools, but in places like the NHS too.
Lots of people are turning to pornography for their sex education and they are seeing awful things like strangulation, which they won't be able to see thanks to this Labour government. I just believe it should be ethical and it should show real sex, like real people.
But her campaign has divided opinion, not least because part of it is bringing sex toys into Parliament to bring attention to the issue. Even colleagues in her own party don't believe it's the right way of addressing the issue. But actually, there aren't many people who disagree with the idea that sex education should be better.
Sometimes they know more about these things than, teachers in the room. The young people are incredibly aware with, what's going on in their lives and especially incredibly literate in the online world as well. We need to be able to kind of keep pace with that and especially keep pace with this ever-evolving climate of, I suppose, violence against women and girls.
Another Labour MP is bringing his own bill to Parliament to make it compulsory until the age of 18.
For too many young people, they've had the worst corners of the internet trying to pitch them to quite extreme ideas about what good relationships should look like for them. That can't be right, so we're looking to ensure that every young person in education up to the age of 18 has got space in schools to have healthy, constructive conversations about what good relationships look like and about healthy sex education.
But what do you think? Are we just not good enough at talking about sex?
Some kids might go directly to AI to ask questions. There should be a human that a child can address questions to.
Give material out so students can do that in their own time. I feel like sometimes in a big group it can be kind of a funny discussion, so they don't take it seriously.
Boys really need to understand that agency is just not on their side and that it's a two-person or matter.
Well, the so-called summer of sex has got people talking, but really isn't that the point of it?
It's positive to start these conversations and to be continuing to have them, not just in the summer, all term round, and also not in school, not just in school time, but at home as well.
And the more politicians in Westminster who talk about it in education, well, maybe the better it will get.
Well, Thangam and Gillian are on the sofa. Thangam, I know you're dying to talk about this. Let's have a bit of analysis on it. I mean, is Samantha Niblett right?
What, when she says that you have to know about pleasurable sex, you have to be able to talk about pleasurable sex in order to be able to talk about nasty, horrible, non-consensual sex? No. I used to work with violent men and we understood what I think they understood also, and certainly their partners understood, that it was about power and control.
Yeah.
And that's how you tell the difference. Yeah. Is this someone who is abusing their power in order to control you? That's how you do the difference. Now, there are maybe other arguments for it, but that, I'm afraid, with the greatest respect for Samantha, I think it's great that she's choosing a campaign, and I was going to say something which has definitely got a double entendre in it. I'm trying to avoid that. I think it's great that she's, she wants to use her position to be a force for good.
She wants to use a position to get everyone talking about her. That's actually what it's about.
Does she not have a point that a lot of boys are learning about sex from the internet? They're learning about violent sex, and it's abuse basically of women, and so therefore to educate and talk about that is a good idea.
Yes, and that's why we updated the RSHE guidance in schools. It was done very recently. Actually, just a year ago, it was done and it was implemented.
So we talked about it then, did we? Or
we
did we just
always have to.
Were we a little bit British about it?
Well, we are very British, and that's a good thing. But I do think, I mean, if you want to lower the opinion of Parliament and its usefulness when people are facing cost of living crisis and worried about whether their young people can get jobs or whatever, this is not the priority. It literally is not. She actually, I've just looked it up because I've never heard of her before. Well, we have, because the last time she brought this up, which was a couple of months ago, she used to work in tech. Talk about women in tech, for goodness sake.
And
this
really
is literally.
I've heard her do that.
Yeah, well, that would be a better, more useful, and more impactful. It is
Gillian
already
being a bit
done.
of a prude, Thangam?
No, she's not. I mean, actually, we're going to have a breakout of agreement again, which we've had
Again,
before.
we usually do.
But no, I think where we're going to agree is the fact that the PHSE, the Personal Health and Social Education on the school curriculum, actually does have sex education in it, and it has a wealth of really good materials in there.
Right, so we don't need MPs talking about it.
I'm not sure it should be
There's
the
other
highest
things
priority.
they should be doing. MPs have got serious jobs, like get the welfare bill under control. Talk about that.
Or talk about jobs and growth or
jobs
AI,
and growth,
which
tech,
Samantha
AI.
actually does know how to do that, and she's really, really good at it. So I mean,
you're just, fun, you two.
I'm sorry, we don't.
It's not in the job
It's
description. When I got the job description, I thought I was going to make, changes for the better. This is not something that an MP can change.
Whereas I think
you can change it yourself with your
talking
partner.
about women in tech, which is something Samantha's brilliant at talking about, knows a lot about. I'd really love to hear her talking about that. But, I respectfully disagree, Samantha, if you're watching.
You're not the only one. Everyone disagrees.
I feel a bit sorry for her. Well,
you agree with it. That's fine.
She's got a serious analysis.
She's actually doing it deliberately.
All right, gotta go. Before we go tonight, we leave you with dogs dressed up as superheroes. Obviously, over 500 people and their pets attended the start of Comic Con Week in San Diego. Some seemingly more enthusiastic about their superhero status than others. That's it for tonight. Thank you again. See you tomorrow at 7.